Thanks everybody for joining. The purpose of today's session is to give you a baseline for using JavaScript within Domino Vault. Using JavaScript is not something that's required, but it is something that can enhance what you can build within Domino Vault. So just a quick look at the agenda. We're going to go through these. Much of what I've put together is around first kind of high level, what is the JavaScript API, how does it work, and then moving into some of the finer points of working with the different objects that you have inside of Vault and the kinds of things that you might want to do with JavaScript, and typically the kinds of things that I've had to do throughout my experience of working with the product, implementing things for customers. So I found them to be difficult to maybe understand at the beginning, and so by putting them here, it gives you an idea of what you might need to do. And these are all areas that we also recognize and we want to make easier to do. So they're part of things that we're considering for future enhancements as well. All right, so the first thing that is the most important to know about the JavaScript API is that you start off in a sandbox, and that means that you do not have access to many of the standard JavaScript objects and functions like document and window and this and other functions that, I mean, if you're a JavaScript programmer, you're not going to immediately have access to those things. And a lot of that has to do with how Vault can be deployed, and it's about making sure that as an organization, you decide how much power you want to give to people who are building Vault apps. So when you're working, it's a secure.js property inside of the Vault config. You can change it to false if you like, and then you will have access to everything that you are used to when working with JavaScript. If you're in a sandbox, you can't use standard array notation. The API, we've provided functions, things like get and set. The operators are different, comparing operators. Again, you can't use this, which is what you might be used to using. And being inside a sandbox might limit your ability to import or use third-party JavaScript libraries. Some will work, some might not. I've encountered some that I've been able to use. Standard Dojo objects I can kind of include if I'm in a secure environment, but anything that's written in basic JavaScript where it's going to be using array notation and things like that, you just won't be able to use them unless you go through and replace all of that. So quite a headache there. If you do make a change to secure.js, you will have to redeploy the app for it to take effect. And for more information on the JavaScript library, actually, you can check out the documentation. I see I've got the Leap documentation link here, but on the end, I've got the Vault document link. So the JavaScript model is broken up into two containers. One is interface, and the other one is data. The interface is about interacting with anything that's on and in the UI, right? So anything that's on that canvas, anything that makes up that physical form, the fields, the pages, the sections, the tabs, things that don't actually hold data long-term, they just present in the form. And then you've got the data, and that's the actual business object. It's the what's actually where all the data is and what makes up that data. So things like validity, whether it's required or not, whether it's valid or not, what type it is. So that's all on the data side. There's some global variables that you have access to at different levels within the scope. And so for the interface, it's things like app for application, form, page, item. And everything is, I'm going to say tiered or maybe containerized. So as you can see in the graphic there, an application can contain multiple forms, and a form can have multiple pages, and a page can have multiple items. And so when you're referencing things within the JavaScript, which you'll see later on in the slides, is it's form dot the ID, the page ID dot the item ID, and then something like dot get value. If you're and that would or say form dot page dot item dot is visible would be something that's on the interface side. On the data side, you're going to have the bo dot, which is your business object. You don't have to specify the form, so the bo defaults to whatever form you're in, and then you would just go bo the field ID and then set required or get value, set value, that sort of thing. As I said, variables are scoped, so if you create a variable within the one scope, it's not going to be available at a higher scope. So just something to keep in mind. We interact with items by their ID. It's an advanced property. You can see here I've shown a screenshot of where that is in the item properties. And one tip that I think everyone should take to heart is that use meaningful IDs. You know, it's one thing if you're just building a simple form and you know you're never going to use any sort of JavaScript inside of it, to just let Volt name your objects, which it does by default. And unfortunately, it's just single line 1, single line 2, single line 3. But if you know you're going to be having to write a little bit of JavaScript, change those IDs to f underscore name, f underscore birth date, f underscore whatever it happens to be. Because then when you go and you write that JavaScript and you maintain that JavaScript, you're going to know what does what. And it'll reduce the need to have to put comments in the code, because you're going to say, well, I don't know what f underscore 254 is, and then have to, you know, so debugging that code and maintaining that code is a lot easier if you set meaningful IDs. Some examples of interface functions. All of these functions are documented in the documentation. Again, I got the Leap link there, but the Volt link is later in the presentation. So things like get current user. Now, get current user returns you the login ID of the current user. So it'll be environment specific for whatever you've defined your login attribute to be, whether that's mail or a unique ID of some kind. App get UID gets you the application GUID. I'm not going to go through all of these, but they're pretty self-explanatory. Form get BO gets you the business object for that form. So if your app had multiple forms, you might want to say app.getForm that gets me, say, form 2, and then I get the business object for that, and then I can interact with it. Get page, select page, get visible, set focus, get focus, all that sort of thing here. These are functions that you can use that interact with the UI components of your form. Common data functions that you might use, things like get current stage. It's going to return you the ID of the stage that the form is in. This showing you how it's business object, and then the item that you want to reference, and then your function, set required, get required, set valid, get valid. Is it valid? There's tons of other functions. I would encourage you to at least have a look at the documentation to know what you can play with. A lot of cool things can be done with the JavaScript functions that are there. So JavaScript events. A lot of what we do inside of Volt is going to be based on reacting to a particular event. And everything inside of Volt, all of our objects have events. So at the highest level, we have the application on start. And all of these functions, or these events rather, trigger in a particular order. So we have the application on start that goes first. And then we've got our form events, things like on new. So on new means it's only going to fire once. It's only going to fire when that form is being created that very first time. And then on load happens every time that form is loaded. So it could be happening as a new form, or it could be happening as an existing form that's being opened. Validate button pressed is when the form is being submitted. We have this event that triggers so that we can actually detect, okay, what button was pressed? Now do I want to do something special because of that specific button? Maybe I want to change something in the form. Maybe I want to validate something in the form, and then I can cancel the submit action. And I'm going to show a little bit of that later on in the presentation. Page events, things like on show, or when we navigate to or from a page. Item events, things like on click, on show, on item change, on valid. These are all things that places where you can trigger JavaScript to further enhance the applications that you build. And I've shown here the event view, which I'll show also a little bit later in the presentation. But this is a really great place to see all the JavaScript that's inside of your application. You can add events or code to events within here, but and you can search for things. So if you know that you have code in there somewhere, but you just can't remember where it is, you can click the little find link that's here, and that'll pop open a little dialog box that you can type in what you want to look for, and then it will show you all of the events where that keyword is present. Great tool. I use it all the time. So it's something to really become familiar with. So global variables. We have this mechanism to be able to register functions and variables that you can use anywhere in your application. And it's a container, basically app.getSharedData. And so if you preface any variable with app.getSharedData, it now becomes available anywhere inside of your application. And so you can use it. So here I show you how it's defined. I'm basically registering a variable, setting it a value, and then I'm going to use that where I say, okay, if this number is less than whatever that global variable is, now I'm going to do something. Very useful. Like I said, variables are scoped. So if you're just going to do var global num equals 5, that's only going to be available within the current scope of where you've defined it. It's not going to be available within, like if I defined it in the on item change of a specific field, that's not going to be available in the on item change of another field. So get used to using global variables when you need to make sure that a variable is available within another scope. So global functions, very similarly, we have the global function defined here. And so we define what that function is going to be called on the left side. On the right side, we're defining that it's a function with 2 parameters. And then I do whatever that function is supposed to do. And then below, you can see I'm using that function in a variety of ways. The first one is I'm just passing numbers to that function, but the second use there is I'm showing how I'm passing field values on my form into that function, and then I'm setting the result into a third field on my form. So using a function to take values out of my form and set something else. Again, global functions extremely useful. All right, so one of the big things about when you start working with JavaScript is, all right, how do I debug it? Nobody writes perfect code, and there's going to be problems at some point, and you're going to need to figure out how to find it, how to fix it. One way is, and this way works both when you're in the sandbox environment and you're not inside the sandbox environment, is to use debugger. So if you put this debugger line in your code, and then you open up your browser debug tools when you're rendering the form. So if I do a preview and then I hit F12 or Control-Shift-I, it brings up my browser developer tools. And when I execute that code, it's going to stop at that debugger point. And from that point on, I can then step through the code. The console.log only works if you're not in a sandbox environment. So if your secure.js is equal to false. I want to just flip over here to my Domino Vault environment, and I have an app. I'm going to be showing you more of this app as we go through, but I wanted to show this. So I'm going to just click over here where I have my form. I'm going to open up that debugger, and I'm going to click this button, and you can see that where I have that breakpoint, I now can debug my code. So I can step through, and as items are being assigned, I can see what their values are. And in this particular case, for one of my later slides, I actually have an error in this code, which we'll take a look at later. But just as a quick glance, just wanted to show you that this is how you can debug your code. You can step through. Every browser is different. So this one is Chrome, but Firefox, IE, they all have this capability. The buttons and hotkeys are a little bit different through each. That will become meaningful later. So I will come back over to my presentation, and we will keep moving. So error handling. Volt has some built-in error handling, and we just saw it. I'll go back to my presentation or my demo here in a second. And this dialog, I would say you generally don't want this dialog to appear to an end user when they're using your form. It really is not meaningful for them, and it means that you as the designer did something wrong, or you didn't account for a situation that a user got themselves into. And so if you want to trap errors like this, we can do that using a try-catch block. I wouldn't necessarily do an alert like that. This is just for demonstration. So if I flip back, I'm actually going to close the debugger now. And here you can see I've got an error. It does kind of give me a clue as to what's going on. I will say sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the code can be complex enough that we're not able to figure out exactly what it is. Like here it's a get value. So now I at least have some idea that it's related to an area where I'm using get value. So I might come over here and I say, okay, I know it's a get value somewhere. So these are the 5 places that I'm using get value. And so I can go and try and figure out which one it is. Well, I happen to know where it is because I intentionally put it in there, but I was referencing an item that didn't exist. And this is also a good point to talk about using meaningful IDs. What is single line 1? I don't know. And then how would I find that? Well, it's not so easy to find an ID like that, and so better to use an appropriate name. But now that I've found my source of my error, I will preview my form again. And if I go through my steps, error's gone. But I also wanted to show the trapping of the error. So I'm going to uncomment this code that I had in here. And as you can see, the window actually does some evaluation of your JavaScript as you're writing it. So if you happen to put a reference a variable that it knows doesn't exist, or if you, as you can see, like if you're missing it's the one it's helpful to a point, but it can't actually tell you which brace you're missing. So I mean, there's some things there that you're going to have to work out on your own, but it does at least warn you that you've made a mistake. And so now here I'm trapping that error instead of it going to the default handling. Message is the same, but you may want to handle it a little bit differently than the way we do. And maybe you want to redirect the user. And again, maybe it's one of those more complex areas where you can't foresee the error happening, but it's a way to kind of future-proof your application as you write good code. One of the common uses of JavaScript within applications today is to trigger a service. I believe many of you have used Volt, at least in a basic fashion. And so when we talk about executing services, there's the service configuration panel, and we can have within each item, we have the ability to say, oh, when the value of this field changes, or in this on item change event, I want to call this service. Sometimes we use services with dynamic inputs, right? Where I might have a couple of hidden fields that are the inputs for that service, and I want to set those before I call the service. And in order to do that, we need to make sure that we're not calling the service immediately when the value of the field changes. So we have to call it programmatically. And so there's this object, this get service configuration object, where we can retrieve the service by its ID, and then it has a function call service. And what that does now is we can programmatically call the service. We can delay the calling of the service until exactly when we want it to be called. In addition to that, another very common use is to set up an on-call finish handler. And what that's going to do is it's going to register some code that's going to execute when that service finishes. And so if you want to chain some things together, or when this service finishes, you want to do something, maybe you want to render something else, or maybe you want to copy values from one place to another, this is how you would do that. So we register our service handler, and then we put that code inside of that if block. And depending on where you connect the event, you might also need to disconnect it. So generally, my recommendation is that you put on-call finish handlers in the on load of your form. That's what I would say is the best practice place to put them. But sometimes you need to attach them dynamically, and you might be attaching them in the on show of a particular item. And if you happen to do that, you need to make sure you disconnect it. Otherwise, if that form, if that field maybe goes visible and invisible, and visible and invisible, then every time that on show event executes, you'll be connecting that handler again. So you might get to a situation, which I have in the past, is your whatever code is inside of that handler starts happening multiple times, and it becomes just a strange happening. Your form is misbehaving, and you don't know why, and that can be a really good example of where you need to disconnect your event, or some strange behaviors happening, you can't explain it. So in general, on-call finish handlers should go in the on-load of your form, and if not, then you will need to do a disconnect to make sure that it only fires once. Services in a loop. Now this is, I've included this because it's a question that has come up often, and it's something that I've had to help people do. Services are asynchronous. So when you trigger a service, it spawns a thread and it goes off and it does its work, and then it comes back. And so if you know that you need to trigger multiple services kind of in a row, or maybe you have a set of services that are reusing inputs, and that means you have to trigger them one at a time, then you can't use a for loop. You can't just for I is less than 10, go, call this service 10 times, because they're all going to be stepping all over each other. And so because you're sharing inputs, or maybe because you're sharing the outputs, it's just going to be a mess. You're not going to get the intended result. And so Here is an example. I mean, there's lots of ways you could do this. This is the way that I've been doing it over the last several years, is I create a global variable and then I call my service. And then in my on-call finish handler, I'm checking whether or not I need to call that service again. So is my global variable less than 5? Okay, if it is, I call the service. Otherwise, and then at the end, I increment my service count. And that is going to give you the ability to make sure that you call these in order and that you only call them, as many times as you need to call them. There's a working example of this on the wiki, and there are many examples on the wiki. Some I'm going to refer to again later on in the presentation. I would encourage you to go. We have a Leap wiki as well as a Volt wiki. Lots of really great examples of not only JavaScript, but also lots of other things, services, using tables, lots of great stuff there. Make sure you check it out. Another reason for using JavaScript is to trigger a submit button. Now, maybe you want to create a custom submit button rather than using the ones that we provide. Why would you do that? You could put it anywhere you want in your form. There's more styling options. You can use images to represent your buttons. So in order to do that, we have to access the buttons in a particular way. There's this get stage actions. It returns you all of the buttons that are available in that stage. And then and usually it's going to be anywhere from kind of 2 to 4 or 5 buttons, depending on what your workflow is. So we find the ID, the button ID we're looking for, and then we activate it. And I'll just pop over to my form here. Here's an example of where there is a built-in submit button, which I can hide. But here is where I've created my own button, and this is actually a preview. So I'm gonna pop back over to my live application. And here we can see, should see, I can submit this way, but I could also submit using my custom submit button. And I have some validation here that's actually coming up on my next slide. But I'm using that code that I showed in my slide, which is get the stage action buttons. And so if I go and I take a look at the events on click, here we can see I'm getting the stage actions, and then I'm saying, okay, well, if it was this particular submit button, then I want to activate it, and that forces the submit to happen. Working with tables. So tables can be used in a lot of different ways. We actually have a presentation that's going to be dedicated just to tables and their uses coming up in a few weeks. I'll be leading that one as well. But I want to talk, because there's a lot of stuff that you would do in JavaScript, I wanted to give a little bit of a precursor to that here, and there'll be more in the next session. So there's UI components to a table, but then there's also data components to a table. And the first thing here is I want to get the selected row. And so we have this item.getSelection that is a function that pertains particularly to a table. And then once you have that selection, so it returns you the selected row, you can then dig into that row and return the values of the different fields that are there. And so that's what I've done here. So item.getSelection, and then get me the single line. Again, I'm not using a great ID, but I can then return that into my variable that I've created. And in this case, I'm not using a global variable because I'm only using that variable within the current scope. So again, you decide where you want to use a local or a global variable, and global being that app.getSharedData. If I want to create a row inside of a table, there's this create new function. So you're basically creating a template of that row, and that then gives you access to all of the columns or the fields inside of that table. So then I would say, okay, now I want to set that value. to red, and then I'm going to add it to the table. So once I've defined all of the columns in my template row, I then add it to the table. If I want to iterate over table items, then I'm going to get a handle to my table object, and then the table object has a getLength function, so I can do a for loop and I can say walk over all of the items in the table, get each row, and then I can do something with that data that I have retrieved. Go back over to my, I'll take a look here. So I've got this table page, and I've got a table. I've basically created a way to pre-populate my table. You saw me do it earlier. I'm going to be doing it here again. So I click my button. It actually puts values into the table, and then table also can be used like that, which I'm sure you guys are aware. And then when I do my code to iterate over, I got to fix my code first. And I'll show you the code in greater detail here in a second. So iterate, populate table, iterate over. I'm pulling all the values and I'm putting them into this field here. And then with the selected, you can see that as I select, I'm putting the value over here. We use this in a lot of different ways. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail now because that's stuff that I'm presenting in the next session. But there's a lot of unique ways that tables can be used to create really high-end user experiences. And anyone, if you've seen any of Marty's demos, he highly uses tables in that way. And the code that I'm showing you here is a huge part of that. You'll find this code in nearly every one of Marty's apps where he is leveraging tables. So we're getting the selection, and then one thing here that's important is that you should check to make sure that selection is not defined. You can also, if you want to clear a selection, you do a set selection to -1, and then that will remove the selection from the table. And then take a look at the iterate over again. For loop, I'm pulling, basically getting each row, and then from there I can get it at the objects that I want. One thing that I want to show, if you guys haven't seen it, is that we have this JavaScript helper. It's a menu. It shifts space. You can see it actually tells you here in the UI, and all of the objects are here. So if I wanted to see what else might be in my table, I can expand the table, and I'm able to pull it right from there. So we have made it easier that you don't necessarily have to know what the ID is, but I would still highly recommend that you use meaningful IDs, because when you're actually looking and reading the code, you should be able to understand what the code is doing without having to go after all those other helpers. All right, so that's our tables. Working with lists. Lists have some other things that are unique to them. Multi-select list is the value of a multi-select list is a concatenated string. And what this is 2 underscores, a hashtag, and 2 underscores. So when you're working with multi-select lists and their values, it's important to understand that when you're using them within JavaScript, you're going to have to split that value out, and you can use the split function. So it's quite easy to say, okay, get the value of the multi-select list, split it into an array based on the underscore underscore hashtag underscore underscore, and then from there you can now work with those selected choices. List options are an object, and that object has a title and a value. And so within the Volt UI, you will have seen us reference things like the saved value and the display value. This gives us the ability to have differing values. So the display might be Connecticut, but the saved value might be CT. right? Where you can provide abbreviations or numerical values as saved values instead of the full display text. So if I want to create a dynamic option set, I do it this way. I create an array, and then I would push objects that have a title and a value, and then I can do the set options. And here you can see I've set a drop down, I've set a select one, I've set a select many. They all work exactly the same way. The objects are all the same, and that's how you do that. I've got a form here I'm going to show you. And the before options update event, I want to call that out because it's really important, especially if you're going to be doing anything with dynamic lists, because it changes the behavior of how those lists work. And the on before options update, it basically changes how the lists interact with dynamic content. So the recommendation is that if you're going to be dynamically populating the options of a list, it doesn't have to be a drop down, sorry, you want to make sure that that before options update, you put return false. And what that means is if I set a value and then I go back and I change the parent, it clears it from the list. And I can show you exactly the way that behaves in a second. So here's my example of, as a multi-select, the value comes out in that delimited list. And here I am dynamically creating my version dropdown based on what product they select. Let's take a quick look at the code behind that. So here in the first one, the versions on my events, I've got this return false. Very important to do, as I said. And in my dropdown for my product, this is where I'm dynamically determining what shows up in my versions. Now, again, there's a couple ways you can do this. One is you can do it with services. I didn't go into that because that's actually a session that's coming up. We have a session that's all on services and populating dropdowns and other things for your applications. So I wanted to leave that for that. This is specifically using JavaScript to dynamically update the options within your lists. And just as I showed in my slide, I'm creating a new array. I'm pushing, what I've done is I've created a higher level object that then I can programmatically interact with. So this might be a really good model for you to just cut and paste and use, because if I wanted to add a third product, I can do that just like this, and I'll just go 10 and 11. And now if I preview my form, we should see, actually, I have to add the first one in here. So there's my 10 and 11, right? So it makes it really easy if you are going to be using JavaScript to have something like that, where you have a way of quickly adding the things that you want. And this is really the processing code that you shouldn't have to change if this is the technique that you're using. So that's lists. Let's see. There's lots of unique ways that I've used lists. You know, one in particular was I used 2 multi-select dropdowns, and when I selected from one, it pushed it into the other to indicate a multi-selection. So there's lots of creative things that you can do with these controls, and using JavaScript to kind of change or force a particular behavior. And really, yeah, it's neat to play with those things. All right, validation before submit. So this is, early in the presentation, I talked about validate button pressed, the validate button pressed event. And this is really helpful if you have multiple submit buttons. Maybe you have a complex workflow and there's certain things that you want to validate before they submit. We can do that in this validate button press event. So this event is triggered when a submit button is clicked. And then in there, we have this P action ID, which is, it contains the ID of the button that was clicked. So now we can actually do something. We can say, okay, look, if the P action ID was equal to this particular submit button, then let's check something. Do they actually, in this case, I've built an example that just says, hey, do they have the minimum hours to meet the requirement? And so let's pop back over here. Right, so client engagement form, if I want to try and submit this, it's not going to let me because I don't have the minimum hours. I don't actually remember why that's not working. Oh, it's a preview, that's why. Okay, here we go. All right, so if I try to submit, it's not gonna let me submit because I don't meet the minimum requirement. I'm not gonna fill in the rest of the form, but as once I have my hours that get to 50, now it's gonna let me submit. So I've used that validate button pressed event to trap the submit event, and then if they don't meet the requirement, I return false, basically cancels the submit. And it gives us the ability to create some really interesting behavior in our forms, make sure that forms aren't being submitted incorrectly or without all the information that they should have. Lots of cool ways that you can use that. All right, so the last slide here, this is the proper link to the Volt JavaScript documentation, and from there, the rest of the documentation is there. There's a Domino Volt wiki, has a lot of really great examples. The HCL Leap wiki I included because it also has even more examples. The only thing is that not everything there works in Volt yet. So, but lots of great resources for you to get your hands on to see what kinds of things can be done, what kinds of things have been done, and a lot of really good learning material in addition to what we've talked about today. And a lot of what you're going to be shown over the next couple of weeks has been pulled from these resources. So if you're keener and you want to get a head start, go take a look at that content. That'll really give you a leg up when you start working with Volt and you want to build really great high-end applications. And that is the end of my presentation.